Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Modern Meathead Experience. This week, we have another solo cast. Don't know if that's good or bad for you. That's for you to decide. Ethan is 3 weeks out now. So really getting down to crunch time, and I'm excited to kind of talk with him post comp about the whole thing and about what he will change or what he won't change moving forward. So today we're going to talk about range of motion. We've talked about range of motion. We've had a few episodes on it in the past in the context of a discussion between Ethan and I. We've talked about the muscle length thing, which I'm going to expand on a little bit today, but more next week on. But this week, what I'm really going to try to focus on is this discussion of range of motion, because generally speaking, I find that this discussion seems to invade every other discussion we have about exercise. And yet, as a topic, I think that very often it's not well elucidated insofar as how many variables there are to consider in the discussion of range of motion, and then specifically how those variables actually impact or should impact our decision making in the context of exercise. And every day, pretty much without fail, I'll post a story on Instagram or something like that, or I'll make a post on, my Reels feed. And inevitably someone will ask some kind of question about range of motion. It's staggering to me just how relevant this topic is to the industry, but also simultaneously just how low resolution the conversations are about it, and how low resolution I think the conversations are between people who often are talking about this. Okay, so I'll get questions like, why aren't you using full ROM or full range of motion? Bro, why aren't you locking out this press or this triceps extension? Bro, why aren't you going all the way down? Why aren't you getting that deep stretch, Ben? I thought the stretch was the most important thing, Ben. So we're going to talk about these kinds of statements and these kinds of questions. And the way that we're going to do it, or the way that I'm going to do it, is through a discussion of range of motion from first principles sort of outward, right? Because generally speaking, when people talk about range of motion, they don't even begin to define range of motion at its sort of most granular level, but then also at the levels that I think are also relevant to consider. And as we'll come to know, there are multiple different levels of range of motion, or kinds of range of motion, I should say, that need to be considered and then also specified when you're talking about it broadly. Okay, so let's dive in. So what are sort of first things to consider about range of motion? Well, broadly speaking, range of motion can refer to a lot of things, but in a general sense, it really just refers to the distance through which something travels. Okay, so that could be in relationship to your joints. It could be in relationship to your muscles. It could be in relationship to the implements you're using. And guess what? All of those things are interacting with one another, right? Simultaneously. And so to say more range of motion or less range of motion, people generally have an idea of what that kind of means. But I think it's kind of like saying something, but also nothing at all. Because again, range of motion, generally speaking, just refers to like how much distance did this object or did you travel through? And oftentimes, again, it's not made more specific than that. So let's talk about now what the different kinds of range of motions are, and then specifically what the impacts of different range of motion are in relationship to resistance training, right? Because that's ultimately what we're talking about here, is we're talking about lifting weights. So first things first, I'm going to talk about the kind of range of motion that I think most people think of when they think of range of motion, or maybe not the one that most people think of, but the one that most people are unknowingly referring to when they talk about range of motion, which is range of motion of an implement. Okay, so again, this is the sort of the category of ROM that I think most people are alluding to when they talk about range of motion. And implement range of motion in my book is really, synonymous with how much does the external object that you are moving change as you're going through the range of an exercise. So for example, implement range of motion refers to how much, let's say, a barbell travels in the context of a bench press. If you're a power lifter, what you're essentially trying to do is you're trying to, in most cases, minimize the range of motion, minimize the travel of the bar so that you can maximize how much load is on the bar. And people sort of think about this inversely in the context of hypertrophy training, muscle growth training, where they say, well, we should just try to move the implement as much as is possible. But as we'll kind of come to realize here as I go through the different kinds of range of motion, uh, I think in a broad sense, that claim can be somewhat useful, but I think it kind of falls apart upon deeper levels of analysis and a little bit more in-depth discussion. So again, implement range of motion just refers to how much does this external object move. It does not tell you anything about the range through which a muscle travels in terms of its excursion and how much tension it is capable of generating within that excursion. It does not tell you anything about how much the relevant joints are moving. It does not tell you which muscles are involved at any point in the range, and it does not tell you what portion of the exercise may be more or less difficult. So implement range of motion simply refers to how much an external object moves and does not necessarily imply anything in terms of the words good or bad without more context. Okay, and so that's kind of where the problem begins, but that is not where the problem ends. Okay, the problem really ends up in a place where people end up talking about implement range of motion, i.e., how far an object you are holding or moving moves in space, how far it travels total within the context of a single exercise. And it stops there without reference to these other relevant kinds of range of motion, which actually impact, what the outcome of the exercise is to a much greater degree. So for example, if you saw me doing a barbell bench press, right? And let's just say I was using like the bottom half of the range of motion. What you would conclude, or what one might conclude, insofar as my experience would indicate, based on that, is that I'm using a partial range of motion. Let's say the bottom 60% of the motion, where maybe I'm lowering the bar close to my chest and I'm pressing it about halfway up, a couple inches off my chest. One might say that I'm using a partial range of motion or a limited range of motion, and that may or may not, depending on where the person is coming from, be more effective for a given goal in their eyes. Now, there may be certain instances where that is the case. There may be certain instances where that's exactly the opposite kind of thing that you would want to be doing, right? And two examples that might elucidate that would be, well, if I'm using the bottom half of the range of a barbell press, that's typically the range of motion, which is actually much more specific to loading the shoulder as compared to the elbow. At least, if you're doing a bench press in a relatively standardized normal way where your elbows are directly underneath of your wrists. However, for the goal, let's say, of training the triceps, it might be counterproductive, right? Again, this will change depending on, let's say, what grip you choose to take and how that affects your forearm angle and where your elbow ends up. But in many cases, if your goals are to train the triceps with any kind of press, you would either want to sort of set that press up differently to begin with, or simply use more of the top half of the range where proportionately the triceps will actually play a little bit of a greater role in the motion. Now, whether or not I would do a top half partial bench press to train my triceps is not really the relevant consideration. The relevant consideration and the takeaway here is that if we look at an exercise from the outside and we look at how much the bar is moving and we make a sort of gross conclusion about what is better or worse just based off of that, we're missing a lot of information that could otherwise inform us a little bit better. So, what are the other kinds of range of motion and how do they sort of overlap with implement range of motion? So the first kind of range of motion, and this is in no particular order, is range of motion of a joint, right? So joint range of motion. Now, joint range of motion specifically refers to the angular distance. In other words, how much in terms of like angle change does a joint move within the context of a given exercise. So if I'm thinking about joint range of motion, in that same example of the bench press, I would need to be a little bit more granular with my assessment, where rather than referring to how much the bar is moving upward and downward, I would need to say, okay, here is the position of my shoulder at the top of the motion. Let's say 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, where if you're watching me on the video, your arms would sort of be locked out in front of you. And, my arms maybe travel down to like in line or slightly behind my body. I might be able to say that the shoulder travels through a total excursion of about 90 to 110, 120 degrees, right, into shoulder extension, where my arms are now down at my sides or maybe slightly behind my body. So joint range of motion simply refers to the range of motion of the joint as measured by angle, specifically in any exercise. And that needs to be, again, specific to the joint and specific to the exercise. We can't then look at that and make some kind of extrapolation based off of the exercise alone that would inform us to any meaningful degree. Now, another sort of range of motion consideration in the context of joints in the bench press would be something like, how much does the elbow bend? You know, if I'm again trying to do a bench press, which is mainly to train my shoulders, that's, you know, less of a consideration, but it's still sort of part and parcel of something we need to analyze. So at the top of the bench press, my elbows may be fully straightened, right, fully locked out. And at the bottom of a bench press, my elbows may bend anywhere from 90 to 120 or more degrees. And so in that specific case, we would be referring to the joint range of motion of the elbow. So we have really two kinds of range of motion outlined already. Implement range of motion, how much something moves externally to our bodies, which may or may not be related directly to joint range of motion, right? So obviously, if the distance that the implement travels is greater, you can reasonably assume that the joint range will also be greater. But depending on the exercise that you're doing, right, whether or not it's a quote unquote compound motion or an isolation motion, quote unquote, you may be actually looking at a situation where you could get more joint range of motion that's not specific to your goal, right? So again, if I take that bench press example and I talk about it, you know, in sort of the bottom half, top half partial thing, I may be traveling through much more shoulder range of motion proportionate to elbow range of motion if I just use the bottom half. Whereas in the top half, I would be actually potentially utilizing a lot more elbow range of motion as compared to shoulder range of motion. So if you just sort of generalize, you know, an exercise as this is more or less range of motion, you may be talking about the implement, or you may be talking about the joint or joints. And that if you are talking about the joint or joints, you need to specify which joint you're talking about. And then as an additional layer, how that motion of that joint within that given range actually impacts the exercise and the outcome, right? So already we've only gone through two different kinds of range of motion. And I don't know how long I've been talking, but I've been talking for, you know, at least a reasonable amount of time just to dissect these things in a very generalized way. And already this is likely a lot more in-depth of a take on range of motion than you might have heard before, right? Because what you've heard before might have only been one kind. That kind of range of motion may not have been specified. And oftentimes, because those kinds of discussions are not specified to any greater degree, especially in a short form, sort of Instagram format or TikTok format, whatever it happens to be, you end up with a really, really generalized takeaway with no practical application ability, and something that sort of falls apart without context. And when you do start to look at these things in context, you start to realize that there's a lot more layers to the cake than you might have assumed otherwise. Okay, so implement range of motion first. Second, joint range of motion, and specifically which joints are sort of moving more and what ranges. And then third, and this is obviously directly related to the other two, in some sense, we have muscle range of motion. So muscle range of motion basically just refers to exactly what it sounds like, which is how much length change does a particular tissue go through within a specific range of motion of a joint. So referring to the bench press example, the muscles of my shoulders, we'll just generalize this for now to say the pecs. The range of motion that my pecs go through during the process of bench pressing is drastically different depending on the portion of the range that you're talking about. So let's use that same sort of initial comparison between doing the bottom half press and doing the top half of the press. Many people will refer to just doing the bottom half of the press as a lengthened partial or something similar, right? Or a partial range of motion, but they don't often define for what, right? Because if we just actually looked at the pecs, and obviously this will depend on how you set things up, your individual structure, et cetera, how you're doing things, but on a generalized level, if we just look at the bottom half of the bench press as compared to the top, and we look at the mechanics and the differences between those two kinds of different variations of a bench press, If you're just doing the bottom half of range of motion of a bench press, you're actually taking the pecs specifically through a very large excursion of their actual muscle length change in the bottom half of the press as compared to the top. Now, this would require visuals to sort of demonstrate, but hopefully you can just trust me in saying that from a mechanical perspective, the pecs go through a substantial amount, probably 80 to 90% plus of their range of motion just in the context of the bottom half of the press. Now, again, this relates directly to joint range of motion and the things that I just outlined about the differences in shoulder motion relative to elbow motion. And so obviously these two things are directly related. But then you have this sort of additional layer of, well, I can do a bench press where my arms are sort of going out wider to my sides, but I can also do a bench press where my arms are more tucked into my body, and those things will be very different. Now, again, assuming in those two scenarios that my elbow joint is sort of stacked underneath of my wrist, I can then say, well, as an additional layer, pressing a little bit with a wider arm path will actually change the muscle range of motion and the length change of those specific muscles throughout the excursion. Whereas doing a narrow sort of press will actually change which of the pecs lengthens more proportionate to the first variation. So to make this concrete, if you do a wider grip bench press where your arms are coming out to your sides close to 90 degrees of abduction, where your arms is sort of, make a T with your arms, that's sort of the position that you could be in at the bottom, versus a more narrow press where your elbows are more tucked to your rib cage. Those two situations will change the muscle range of motion that your pecs go through in either case. So for example, if you use a wider press, your upper pecs, and specifically the upper half of the middle pecs, will go through a greater relative length change as compared to the lower half of the pecs in sort of the lower half of the middle pec and the lower or costal/abdominal pec. So if you choose to use a wider grip, the muscle range of motion will actually be greater for the upper half of the pecs than the lower half of the pecs. If you use a narrower grip, again, this is all sort of within the context of a flat bench press, the range of motion that your middle and lower pecs go through will be greater per unit distance traveled, sort of as your arms lower and move behind your body as compared to the upper pecs. So we've talked about three kinds of range of motion so far, and we've talked about a couple of different contexts that can sort of, just in terms of arm path or range of motion used, totally change the range of motion that we're talking about. And already we have all these different layers to sort of look at as it relates to the goal. So, for example, if my goals are really just to train my upper pecs with a flat press, I might just use the bottom half of the press and a wider grip so that I can maximize for the muscle range of motion that I go through, even though the implement range may be smaller, and even though the joint range apparently would be smaller, right? Even if the joint ranges and the implement ranges are actually decreased, that doesn't necessarily imply that the muscle range will be decreased. In fact, in some cases, as in the case of a wider grip press, the muscle range that the upper pecs go through, again, this will obviously change depending on the angle, et cetera, individual variance, et cetera. But overall, I can generalize to say that the wider arm path press will look like less joint and implement range, and it will actually be more range of motion to the target tissue, which may be the upper pecs, depending on how you set it up. And conversely, I may use a narrower grip, which may end up looking like more joint range and more implement range of motion. But that might actually not be beneficial in the context of upper pec training and would rather be more beneficial in the context of middle and lower pec training. So again, all these things need to be contextualized relative to what kind of range of motion you're talking about. And then in addition, you need to talk about what the goal is, which ultimately in the context of, training muscles is muscle. You need to have an identified muscle you're trying to train. And then you need to look at, okay, how do the joint and implement ranges relate to that muscle range? And am I using certain joint ranges and implement ranges that are actually aligned with my goal? Or am I just trying to use more range for the sake of more range or less range for the sake of less range? Because again, changing any one of these three kinds of range of motion can impact the others. And whether or not that's appropriate, whether or not, excuse me, you view that as good or bad, will really depend on what you're trying to do. So sort of to summarize what we've covered so far, right, before I move on to other kinds of range, because there are two sort of other things that I think need consideration here. We have implement range. And in this example, again, just range of the barbell. How far does this thing travel upward and downward or side to side? Joint range, which refers to specific joints like the shoulder joint or the glenohumeral joint or the scapulothoracic joint or the sternoclavicular joint or the elbow joint, right, in the context of a bench press. Of course, there are other joints that need to be considered in the context of force, like things going through your hands and your forearms and potentially some of your spine. But for now, we can safely ignore those just to kind of focus in on this example. And then lastly, we have muscle range of motion, which changes drastically depending on the joint range and the implement range. And in some cases, muscle range of motion will be greater when motion of the implement actually seems to be smaller. And in other cases, muscle range may be smaller in the instance where implement and joint ranges actually appear to be larger, as we discussed in relationship to the upper pecs versus the lower pecs. Now, overall, if we zoom out and we say, Ben, well, isn't it just okay to sort of generalize that, like, if I use a comfortable arm path and I use more range of motion, that I'll safely sort of target at least vaguely what I'm trying to target? Yeah, I would say that is safe to say. But again, my context and application of talking about these kinds of things is really to point out the sort of pitfalls that we run into when these things are overgeneralized. It's not to say that generalized recommendations can't or could never be helpful. Of course, they can be. But if we're trying to be a little bit more granular and precise about what we're actually saying, these kinds of range of motion also need to be considered in tandem with that discussion of the end goal. Okay, so what kinds of range of motion do we also have to consider that are not just implement, joint, and muscle related? Well, if many of you have, or if any of you have sort of looked into the discussion of range of motion, at some point, you've likely come across this discussion of active versus passive range of motion. Now, I think that these two terms in the context of exercise are kind of synonymous in some ways, but I wanted to sort of detail out some differences more broadly and then hone in on an exercise context afterward. So active range of motion is generally defined as something like, how far can someone actively control a motion? So for example, if I raise my arms up and overhead from a standing position, excuse me, that is my active range of motion for raising my arms up overhead. But passive range of motion is kind of referring to this concept of, well, I'm not creating the motion myself, but something or someone else is creating the range for me. So for example, if I were to lift my arm up and overhead, you could consider that active range of shoulder flexion, my arm, going forward up and over my head. But if I were, let's say, laying down on a table and someone was holding all of the weight of my arm, they could measure something called passive range of motion, where I'm not really trying to move in any direction. I'm allowing someone else to actually move my arm up and overhead. Now, whether that's from a standing position or a seated position or a lying position will probably change things. And we'll talk about that in just a second when we talk about the influence of resistance and how this actually impacts this whole conversation. So active range of motion is, hey, how far can I actively, upon my own volition and upon my own ability to create contraction, how far can I move this joint? How far can I contract this muscle? And passive range of motion refers to, okay, there's this, external thing, external force, be it a person or a load that I'm holding, that is moving me into a position, and I'm not really trying to resist it in any way. I'm just sort of being smushed, if you will, into those positions. Now, active range of motion and passive range of motion are oftentimes used by, let's say, physical therapists and trainers who are disguised as physical therapists as assessments for function. I think that there are many, many problems with this, but sort of to debunk it a little bit, I'll just say that how you assess active and passive range of motion really can determine exactly what the outcome it is. So, for example, if I assess active range of motion, to use that same scenario that I discussed earlier of overhead shoulder range, I can do that in a ton of different scenarios. So for example, I can do that standing upright, right? I can stand and I can be like, hey, how far can I raise my arm up and overhead? But I can also do that lying down, right? If I'm lying down, all of a sudden I can raise my arm up and overhead with a degree of resistance that is actually assisting me in that position, right? If you lie down and you bring your arms up overhead, your arms want to fall in the direction that they're moving. So these two scenarios, just the two that I mentioned, are actually entirely different. Why are they entirely different? Well, because the resistance that I am acting against actively is different. So take two scenarios that may make this more clear. One, where you're lying down facing upward, right, on a table, and you're sort of slowly lowering your arm into that overhead position, right? Because it would be lowering in that context. And then take the opposite example where now maybe you're lying face down. And let's say that like your arm is hanging off of your table and you have to raise your arm up and sort of overhead. The way that you perform those motions, one of which is, gravity is assisting you, and the other of which gravity is technically resisting you, right? Where you're lying down and you're raising your arm up and forward. Those are two opposing scenarios from the perspective of their resistance, right? Because one scenario, you're lying down and you're lowering your arm. And in the other scenario, you're lying down flat on your stomach and you're raising your arm. So the muscle recruitment is completely different, right? As you're lowering your arm up and overhead, you're using shoulder extensors, right? Muscles that basically pull the arm backward, right? As in a row or a pull down or something similar, or a pullover would be, maybe the most relevant. And you're also using some, accessory tissues like maybe some pecs also. So you would have some shoulder flexion involvement in that as well. Depending on the joint position, it can change, but without getting lost into that sort of trap. In another instance where you're lying down flat on the table and you're raising your arm up and overhead, you're using pretty much exclusively shoulder flexors, right? So to raise my arm up and overhead from a lying position where my stomach is on a table, I would need to use muscles like my front delts, potentially my middle delts. I would need to use my traps to a substantial degree to help in that upward rotation and stabilization of my shoulder girdle. And in the instance where I'm lying down on my back and I'm lowering my arm, I would need to use muscles like my lats, potentially my teres major, potentially my rear delt, depending on how my arm is aligned, potentially my pecs, right? And all these things influence the outcome of range of motion that you perceive. So my problem with this is not necessarily in describing these things, because, if you're just objectively analyzing the forces and the mechanics of these motions, you're sort of giving a very straightforward factual analysis of these things. My problem is in the weight that specific people put on specific positions to determine things like function, whether it be muscular function, joint and connective tissue function, et cetera, right? Because if I do an assessment where someone is lying down and I'm having them lower their arms, they're using totally different muscles as compared to if they're flat on their stomach and they're raising their arms. But for some reason, people actually seem to value one of these assessments, usually the one where people are lying down on their backs, far more than another. And there's no necessary reason that that should be the case. There's no reason that we should just randomly be favoring one resistance scenario over another. And in the same sense, if you're measuring something like shoulder internal or external rotation, those measurements are going to be completely different depending on how your body is oriented relative to gravity, and also depending on whether you're doing it actively or passively. So if any of you have ever seen a physical therapist or seen these sort of pseudo physical therapist personal trainers assess people, what they often do is they'll have someone lie down flat on their backs. They'll have them take their arms up and out to the sides, around 90 degrees. And what they'll do is they'll measure internal and external rotation of the shoulder passively. So why did they choose to do it passively? I'm not sure. Why didn't they choose to do it actively? Why did they choose to do it from a lying position, lying on the back, as opposed to a seated position, holding the arm up and out to the side? Why, if they chose a seated position, did they choose to do it that way instead of lying down? Or why did they choose to do it either one of those ways when they could have done it lying flat on the stomach, having someone assess their range of motion into internal and external rotation with an opposite force, right? Why these things are the case is not, or asking that question is not really answerable in a generalized sort of a way. Someone may give a specific reason like, oh, we're trying to minimize these things and just isolate, okay, what is the joint doing? But then you could ask an additional question, which is, well, why is the joint in a 90-degree position, right? Shoulder, if you're lying down flat on your back, shoulder abducted 90 degrees, you're measuring the rotation. Why are you doing it in that position instead of a position where their arm is more comfortable to their sides, potentially, right? So if you sort of get down to the nitty gritty of these things and you start to ask, well, why this position instead of this one? Why are you using this resistance instead of this one? Why are you doing it passively versus actively? Or why are you doing it actively versus passively? Right, these sorts of generalized claims start to sort of fall upon, or sort of start to fall apart underneath their own weight, and people end up sort of eating their own tails by their own logic, because at the end of the day, there's no clear reason that we may want to do these assessments in an active or a passive way, or in the positions that they're commonly measured, right? And if you dig deep enough, you find that there's often no strict objective rationale. It's just like, oh, this is the way that things are done, right? And that's how we end up saying silly things. That's how we end up saying things out of context. And that's how we end up making sort of bogus claims in a sort of generalized way that end up not being helpful or practical. But it is a great way to sort of indoctrinate people into a specific system or a specific belief. Now, another thing that is sort of not necessarily a category of range of motion, but sort of exists as an umbrella effect across all these different things, is how range of motion can change. So oftentimes when people are passively or actively assessing range of motion of a joint, of a muscle, whatever, what they say or what they do is they'll make an initial assessment. They'll say, okay, this is the range of motion that you had the first time that we tested this thing. And then maybe we do some intervention. Maybe we breathe into a balloon. Maybe we hang from a bar. Maybe we stretch, whatever. And then they'll assess range of motion after the fact. And so this umbrella sort of a range of motion term or idea is really like not specific to any one of the ranges, but rather the delta of the ranges, meaning how much does this thing change before and after I do something? And people also put a lot of weight into changing range of motion, right? So oftentimes what you'll see is people will do these kinds of tests where they're lying down on tables or sitting upright and they're assessing range of motion. An intervention, if you can call it that, will be performed. And then afterward, the range of motion will be assessed and sort of the difference between those two things will be the outcome that people are looking for. So let's imagine that your goal, let's say, is to improve shoulder internal rotation. For whatever reason, people generally don't have very specific or logical reasons for trying to improve range to begin with. It's usually just a kind of arbitrary standard that people, for some reason, are subscribed to, like, oh, more range of motion is better. For whatever reason, who knows? And so the goal, let's say, initially, if someone can internally rotate their shoulder, 20 degrees, the goal will be like, okay, when we lay back down, we want to make sure that we have more than 20 degrees without any consideration for, why their shoulder may have done that in the first place, what kind of limitations they may be running to. We can't know those things. So again, overgeneralized, gross extrapolations occur. And what we often see is when that range of motion changes, because guess what? Changing pretty much anything about a person in the context of creating more contraction or more tension around a joint will change range of motion of that joint. And that's for a lot of different reasons. The main one is simply that when your body is in a sort of passively existing state, meaning you're just going about your daily life, your body will possess certain ranges of motion according to what you need, right? So if I'm just sitting down recording this podcast, my hips specifically or my shoulders specifically will have a given amount of range of motion available to them. But the second that I change the force scenario and how I'm dealing with the force scenario, range of motion will more than likely change. And the reason it changes is because range of motion is something that is capable of changing because it's not something that is always related to structure of a joint. It could be something related to the muscular innervation around the joint, or again, the tension within the specific capsule, or the fluid shifts that occur within the joint capsule, right? And all those things change the second that force and our relationship to force changes. So what you can do is you can do pretty much anything. You move the joint in any way, create force around the joint in any way, and you will observe a transient change in range of motion. And so what people do, again, these sort of pseudo physical therapists or real physical therapists, what they'll do is they'll make a change to range of motion. And oftentimes people observe that change and they'll just label it as good. But it's not necessarily good and it's not necessarily bad. It's just a response that our body has, a normal response that our body has to changing force circumstances, right? The range of motion that I need to have access to in my hips to sit on my ass and record this podcast is very different from the range of motion that I'll need in 5 minutes if I stand up and go for a walk, right? Which is different from the range of motion that I'll need if I'm doing a leg press, which is different from the range I'll need if I'm doing a leg curl, or if I'm not doing any leg exercise, and maybe I'm doing an upper body exercise, right? So all these things are so context dependent, not only on all the things we've discussed so far, but then in addition, the resistance and how the resistance relates to those joint ranges, that generalizing more or less range of motion in any position doesn't really help us informationally in any way. We can't really draw gross conclusions about these things if we're not being specific to the application. And guess what? Even if we are being specific to the application, excuse me, and we do have a reason for trying to improve a range, Well, that would need to be contextualized in terms of the goal and why we're doing that and what that's helping, at the end of the day. So someone may observe this sort of transient change in range of motion of their joints, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be helpful for them. It might be, but we certainly can't generalize these things to say that more is better or less is better. So far, we've kind of laid out a framework for all these different kinds of range of motion. And so now that we sort of had that under our belts, I want to talk about the most practical and the most relevant stuff, which is exercise range of motion. So exercise range of motion, really in my head, I don't know if other people have used this sort of terminology, exercise range of motion is really what we need to land on when we're talking about range of motion, right? Which is, again, specific to an exercise. And any exercise that we do or discuss is specific to a goal, right? So we start from the goal. What is the goal? We identify the exercise that we're trying to do, right, for that particular goal. And hopefully it makes sense relative to what we're trying to do. And then as a next layer on top of that, we can start to discuss, okay, what are the joint ranges that I would like to use? And what are the muscle ranges that I would like to use? And, if we're doing something in the gym, there's always going to be some degree of active and passive involvement via the joints and the connective tissues and the muscles, that those things just sort of get baked into the cake of this discussion. So let's harken back to our first example of the bench press. And, hopefully I can sort of repeat myself in some ways without it seeming redundant. Maybe now with more information, we have more context. So again, if I do a bench press with my arm path a little bit wider, again, that may appear externally to be less range, but it may internally actually be more range of motion, specifically in accordance with the resistance direction for my given goal, which might be upper pecs or front delts, something like that. If I use a narrower grip and that bar travels further, well, that's not necessarily better unless I'm trying to use a specific joint range within the shoulder that is more specific to the mid and the lower pec tissues. Again, just to contextualize that will change depending on how you're set up, who you are, what it ends up looking like, and so on. But I can generalize this to say that whether or not the barbell moves more is not the relevant piece. The relevant piece is what is the goal, what is the appropriate range relative to that goal, and what makes sense based on the resistance. Does it make sense to just do the top half of the press, right, where there would not be very much resistance on the shoulder and where there would be much more resistance on the elbow? Or does it make more sense to sort of do just the bottom half where the shoulder tissues are more involved? If I sort of took this one step further to say, well, I basically want to get as much muscle recruitment, as much total muscle recruitment as possible out of this single motion. Well, then I would say, okay, use the full range that is comfortable for you. It might not be touching the bar to your chest. It might be touching the bar to your chest. It might be going a little bit wider where your arms can get further back. It might be going a little bit narrow where your arms could get further back. No one is the same. And these things can end up being very different person to person. So let's talk about another example, which is exercise specific, which, depending on what we're trying to do, may make, a specific exercise very different or very differentiated. So let's imagine that I'm trying to do squats. And let's say that just in the context of this discussion, we're going to avoid all the different layers of like the different exercises you could be doing, what you have access to. We're going to ignore that context for now. Okay. Just so that we can focus on this discussion. Imagine if the only thing that I'm trying to do is a squat with a barbell. And in one scenario, scenario A, I'm trying to maximize my quad recruitment. And in scenario B, I'm trying to maximize my glute recruitment. The quads and the glutes cross different joints. The quads cross the knee, one of them crosses the hip, and the glutes only cross the hip, right? And so right away, I have two different muscle groups, both of which are obviously complementary in how they contribute to a squat, both of which will always need to be involved in any sort of free weight squat, regardless of how I set it up. But I can set up two different kinds of squats, which may look very, very different from a implement range of motion standpoint. They may look very different from a joint range of motion standpoint. And because those two things are different and obviously related, the muscle range of motion will also need to be different. Okay. So if my goals are to train more quads, I would advise on a general level that your torso be relatively more upright, that you elevate your heels, okay, so that your ankle mobility is not a rate limiter, and so that your segmental proportions, right, the relationship between your tibias and your femurs and your spine is not a limitation, so that you can maximize knee bend, and so that the load direction is favorable to loading the knee more so than loading the hip. So typically speaking, if any of you have seen, someone like a Tom Platz do a squat, you can also think about like any Olympic weightlifter. These are people who do squats that are, we'll say more maximized for quad recruitment because of these variables, right? Because the torso is relatively more upright, there are fewer forces or lower magnitude forces on the spine and the hips, and there are proportionately more on the knee. Because the heels are elevated, the knee bend is probably easier to maximize, and the deeper you can get maximizing that knee bend. And because the torso is more upright, the load direction will be more favorable to loading the knee as compared to the hip, as I just mentioned, right? So these are your more upright, sort of squatty type of squats, which may again be more favorable to training the quads for those reasons. Now, imagine scenario 2 or scenario B, where you're trying to maximize glute recruitment, right? The glutes just act on the hip, which means that from a direct relationship perspective, bending the knee more will not necessarily mean more glute recruitment. So what that means is if you're just trying to go as deep as you possibly can, you may be sort of missing the mark in terms of maximizing glute recruitment because you may be getting more quad involvement that is necessary relative to your goal. So when I'm trying to maximize for glute recruitment in a barbell squat, you likely do not need to elevate your heels. You might need to, but it's unlikely, at least in many cases. The torso and the trunk position, will be a little bit more bent, meaning that the squat that you do for your glutes will look a little bit more like you're doing a deadlift as compared to like a squatty upright squat. And as a consequence of that, the hip range of motion, the range of motion that your hip joint specifically goes through, and the position of your hips will be different in the second kind of squat as compared to the first. So in the second kind of squat, what we're doing is we are angling the torso more sort of parallel to the floor. We are maximizing the hip bend relative to that, which can happen very early on, relative to motion of the bar. And as a consequence of this, the load direction, the direction of resistance, actually ends up being much farther from the hip and lower spine and closer to the knee. And so all of these things point to being able to create a more glute dominant, hip dominant squat, more spine dominant squat, if you will, as compared to the first variation where we were more upright, where we were elevating our heels, our knee bend was maximized, and the knee joint and the quads were going through a greater joint and muscle range of motion, respectively. But in the second variation, we bent the torso over more. The knees likely bent a lot less. And so the range of motion specific to the quads is lower. The range of motion specific to the knee is lower. And that's actually ideal for loading the hips because what you're doing is you're creating a situation where the hips are much more loaded and the hip bend and the hip range of motion and thus the glute range of motion is much greater, right? And so if you just took a look at these two kinds of squats and you had the generalized opinion that more range of motion was better, specifically more range of motion of the implement and more range of motion of what the whole body looks like it's doing, you might just ignorantly say that the quad dominant squat is better rather than just saying that the quad dominant squat is more specific to the quads. And you might say that the glute dominant squat is worse because there's lower perceived amounts of range of motion at the knees. There's lower perceived amounts of range of motion at the hip and, at the spine and how far the spine travels. There's lower amount of range of motion of the barbell. But in fact, you are creating a force scenario in which the glutes are going to be tasked to work more because they're going through a greater relative amount of length change per the unit distance traveled. And as a consequence of that, you are maximizing for tension through the glutes rather than the quads, right? So could you do a squat in a way which sort of creates a balance of both of these things, a more even sort of contribution? Of course you could, right? But you would need to contextualize that to say, hey, I'm doing a squat, which is sort of a middle ground between the extreme quad dominant and the extreme glute dominant squat, because I want to train a blend of both the knees and the hips in terms of the outcome, which would make it more of a sort of, full lower body, full spine, or spinal erector sort of exercise. So the point here is hopefully clear. which is to say that when we talk about range of motion, we're often talking about one kind, which is the kind in relationship to the implement and how far it looks like our whole body is traveling. And we are often not contextualizing the goal, and we are not referring to joint ranges of motion, muscle ranges of motion, and how those two things actually either are beneficial to or retract from the goal and the effectiveness through which we accomplish the goal. So I think a very simple solution to this is to always start from a place of, what am I trying to do? What is the context of this exercise, and why am I choosing this exercise to begin with? Because if you don't have that and you don't first define that, then we can't start to talk about these different kinds of range of motion and what kinds of range of motion need to be maximized or minimized in accordance with these goals. So when we're talking about range of motion, I think we need to be a little bit more granular, and the discussion on a general level doesn't obviously need to be this in depth, but we should at least start from a place of agreeing upon a context. And then based on that context, we can say, okay, these kinds of things will be more favorable than these kinds of things, right? Because simply optimizing for a single variable and saying that that single variable will dictate all and it will dictate the outcome, that's not good enough. That's not granular enough. And that's not actually helpful in practice, right? On a generalized level, sure, someone who is a newbie in the gym probably doesn't need to be thinking about all these kinds of things, nor should someone who's advanced who really is not super into this stuff, in my opinion. But I do think that if you are going to have a discussion about this, if you're going to create content, if you're going to post these things on a public forum and express your opinions to the masses, you should at least, even if you're wrong, it's fine if you're wrong, you should at least try to define what you're optimizing for and why you're making the decisions that you're making. Because again, speaking in generalized absolutes is not actually helpful to anyone, and it reduces the discussion down and it distills the discussion down to a level which isn't actually reflective of the complexities of all these interactions, right? The complexities of all these interactions are ultimately what will dictate the outcome. And although we can't directly control the outcome and what we sort of receive insofar as hypertrophy and strength, we can do our best to align these kinds of range of motion and optimize these different kinds of range of motion as it relates to our goals. So hopefully that was helpful, and hopefully it was insightful insofar as maybe bringing some things up that haven't been discussed before. Hopefully you come away with this not with a super concise, clear conclusion, but more so just additional things to think about and additional things to question when you hear very generalized claims about range of motion. Because ultimately my goal with this is not to say that more joint range is better or more muscle range is better or active range is more important than passive range or vice versa. My goal is simply to provide some nuance into this discussion and to get you all to think a little bit more, I'll say granularly, if that's a word, or specifically about what kind of range of motion you are referring to when you talk about range of motion. And hopefully when you start to differentiate, okay, what am I talking about and where, you can make your exercises and your exercise selections and the recommendations that you give other people more specific to a context. Because ultimately, again, that's what all this needs to come back to. So start with the context, start with the goal, and work backwards from there and determine what muscle, joint, and implement ranges are appropriate for a given scenario. Hope that was helpful, and always appreciative of any feedback that I get. So please send me an email, modernmeatheads@gmail.com, and I'll see you all next week, where I'm going to talk a little bit more about range of motion, but specifically as it relates to the conversation around muscle lengths, because although I have done with Ethan some discussions of muscle lengths and long length training versus short length training, I want to provide a little bit more of a formal sort of lecture on what my opinions are about the lengthened partial movement and specifically what it misses insofar as, again, being a little bit more granular and specific to the given context of a given goal.